Wendy, thank you so much for joining us from Washington, D.C. for this special preview of Asia Briefing Live. We've got a lot of ground to cover, so I'm just going to dive right in. We are seeing a huge impact from the coronavirus. The WTO says trade could fall by as much as 32%. Supply chains have been paralyzed, and governments and businesses the world over are confronting how to reduce dependency on single sources such as China. How do you see this disruption playing out in the short term? And then let's look at the long-term implications of this outbreak.
Okay. Well, first, let me just say I'm really honored to be here with you all. I had planned to be in Australia now, but unfortunately that trip was canceled. And I'm here in Washington in our 7-week of lockdown. The coronavirus is just having an enormous impact on all of our health systems and economies and societies. And with respect to the economic side, there are a lot of immediate concerns, including just the ability to secure the types of medical equipment, medical supplies, medicines, and potentially even food that countries need during the crisis. And as a result, that's putting an enormous strain on businesses as they try to rejigger their supply chains in order to secure not only these types of goods, but all types of goods. And so that's kind of the immediate kind of reaction, is to try and do whatever people can to identify where they can get the goods they need, to ensure that logistics can get those goods to their ports, and then to be able to get them within their countries. An enormous challenge, which I think over the longer term is going to present some kind of greater thinking about how supply chains should be organized.
You talk about this hoarding by nation states of essential supplies. You know, we've seen reports of nations banning exports of PPE, etc. We've got talk of economic sovereignty, borders being closed. The crisis is demanding a greater self-sufficiency in the short term. Do you think that's going to translate to increased protectionism in the long term as well?
Unfortunately, I do, for two reasons. Number one, I think we're going to we'll be experiencing a recession with very high unemployment globally that we haven't seen in years, maybe since the Great Depression. And as we all know, when there's high unemployment in a recession, typically that leads to more protectionism. But even broader than that, I think what the COVID-19 has shown is that for governments and economies, there's a lot of overdependence on single sources, and particularly with respect to kind of strategic or essential goods. I think there's a concern that governments like the United States, we weren't ready for this. And as a result, our stockpiles weren't high enough. And now we're looking at kind of our vulnerabilities vis-a-vis these products in other countries. So I think companies will end up diversifying their supply chains, but I think governments will also respond with policies to promote and incentivize production within their own borders. I'm not necessarily saying to promote self-sufficiency, but to reduce vulnerabilities and make sure they're ready for the next emergency.
Now, the US-China trade war, we were already beginning to see an alteration of long-established supply chains because of the tariffs, with manufacturing shifting from countries such as China to Vietnam. Will we see a continuation of that trend then as the COVID-19 crisis persists? And what countries could stand to benefit from this?
Well, absolutely. I mean, supply chains are adjusting all the time. And long before even the tariff war, we were seeing some manufacturing moving out of China just because of looking for low wages, for example. Clearly, the tariffs accelerated this move out of China. And I think that the COVID-19, particularly with respect to certain products, will accelerate that shift, particularly as companies look to diversify. Vietnam already has been a prime target for companies to move to. We've also seen movements to Malaysia, to Bangladesh, and elsewhere in the Asian region. But for the United States, I think what we're going to see is more production moving back to our neighborhood, particularly in Mexico, which is also a manufacturing hub. It has, good policies, good logistics, and the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement will come into force July 1, which will provide a lot of certainty and more open markets between the three countries in our region. So I'd watch Mexico closely. I think they're going to be a great beneficiary of kind of this movement of supply chains. But let's also keep in mind, it's not like all supply chains are moving out of China. And if you look at surveys of companies, they intend to keep some production in China. I think what this will mean as they make decisions on where to expand and where to locate, one of the key decisions they'll make will be assessing their vulnerabilities. And that, may lead them to leave China. For some companies, they may decide, we'll stay in China. It's worth the vulnerability given the strengths to our supply chain by being in China.
Sticking with the US-China trade war, the Phase 1 trade deal seems a long time ago now, was signed in January. Does it have any hope of holding, given that China must purchase an additional 200 billion of American goods over the next 2 years? And is there any prospect of Phase 2 talks getting underway?
It's interesting. The agreement's only been in effect 2.5 months. It seems like that signing ceremony in January years ago in the Oval Office. We're already seeing, frankly, smooth implementation in many areas between the United States and China. Just this past week, China issued a detailed intellectual property protection action plan, which was called for in the agreement. They've lifted many non-tariff measures in the agricultural sector that were agreed to, and they've moved to open their financial services markets in accordance to the agreement. Now, you point to the whole area of the purchasing commitments that China made, which were quite ambitious regardless of COVID. I think it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to meet these targets. But I'm hopeful that if both sides are making efforts and the trajectory is in the right direction, that both sides will recognize that due to the circumstances, these unforeseen circumstances, these targets are unattainable. So again, I don't think, the agreement's going 100% smoothly, but I think it's going better than many people had expected, particularly given the tensions between the two countries now on many other fronts, as well as the challenges of COVID-19.
So we have a slowing Chinese economy. We've got countries reducing their dependency on Chinese factories. Is that going to impact on China's ability to project power into the region? And then again, looking through the prism of the trade war, everything in geopolitics is a zero-sum game nowadays. Who is going to emerge from this crisis in a stronger bargaining position, do you think, the US or China?
I think we're going to have to see how all of this plays out, and I'm not sure it's a zero-sum game. What I'm kind of hoping is, as a result of this crisis, that both sides will recognize, at least in certain areas like pandemics, the two sides need to cooperate. It doesn't mean that they need to be best friends. It doesn't, need to mean that this will spill over into other areas. But clearly, there are issues where the U.S. can't solve them alone. China can't solve them alone. The rest of the world is looking for kind of global leadership here. And so I would hope that both sides can find a way to find discrete areas where they can work together. I mean, another area that comes to mind is we haven't even seen COVID really, hit the developing world, particularly Africa and Latin America, in the way that it's hitting the other parts of the world. And, I'm hopeful that not only U.S. and China, but U.S. and China and other countries can come together to really help the most needy here. Because we're all not going to recover until everyone recovers. both from a health perspective, but also economically.
Now we are unfortunately running out of time. I feel we could go on for hours, but there are other sections of the event that are going to be waiting to get underway. So one final question, and this is a question that we will be putting out to the audience as a polling question. So this is a little bit of a teaser for them and gives them an opportunity to get their thinking caps on. How do you think the COVID-19 crisis is going to reshape the global order as we know it? Do you see a rise of the nation state and every man for himself sort of mentality? Or are we likely to see a strengthening of international institutions such as the WTO, which may find increased support as a pathway to finding a way out of this crisis?
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's a loaded question. I would say, let's just remember a lot of these international organizations like the WTO were under a lot of strain even before COVID. And so as with COVID and the challenges it's going to present, not only from a health perspective, from an economic perspective, that might just like overload the WTO circuits as well as other international organizations. I think going forward, what I kind of see is that there'll be different subsets of countries coming together to work on issues with the hope that other countries would join. And we're already seeing this. New Zealand and Singapore in the trade area have moved forward on some tariff-free export restraint lifting initiatives together. We've seen Canada now lead 23 WTO members into a statement about the need to keep borders open for agriculture trade. And so I think what we might see if these institutions as a whole can't operate effectively and do what they need to do, we might see subsets of countries stepping up to the plate. And that might be coupled with just finding discrete areas where all countries can work together in these organizations, not to put forward like this huge ambitious agenda, but to target specific areas like aid to the developing world where they are win-win issues and they don't need to be part of any kind of rivalry between nation states.
Wendy, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Well, thank you. It's been my pleasure.